June 4th, 1943, Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia. The ship had docked after a grueling 2-week journey across the Atlantic, and as the gangplank was lowered, Unteroffizier Hans Schmidt stepped hesitantly onto foreign soil. His legs were unsteady, the exhaustion from the long voyage weighing heavily on him. He gripped the railing of the ship with both hands, trying to steady himself, and as he gazed ahead, he saw a landscape that seemed almost surreal. He had expected to arrive in a place that would confirm all the grim things he had been taught about the Americans, a nation that was weak, fragmented, and unprepared. Instead, he was greeted with a reality that was nothing like what he had imagined. His eyes were tired from the long journey, but the fatigue was nothing compared to the storm of disbelief brewing inside him. The Atlantic had separated him from everything familiar, and now the land before him felt equally distant, unfamiliar, and full of contradictions. This was the land of the enemy. This was the place where men like him had been told to believe in the inferiority of others, where they had been taught that this country was destined to fall. And yet, as he stepped onto the solid ground of the United States, the scenes he witnessed made everything he had been taught feel utterly irrelevant. The first thing that struck him was the sheer scale of the place. The Norfolk base sprawled across 4,300 acres, its docks stretching beyond the horizon. It was a hub of activity, ships coming and going, machinery moving with precision, and workers everywhere. But it wasn't just the size that caught his attention. It was the people. He had been told of a divided, chaotic society, a people incapable of working together. But here, at this moment, he saw something entirely different. White and black workers, side by side, operating cranes and unloading cargo. There was no segregation, no distance between them. In fact, the men worked in harmony, a unity that felt unnatural, almost impossible to him. Women, wearing coveralls and looking no different from the men, were in charge of massive cranes, guiding them with a confidence and ease that seemed foreign to Schmidt. He had been taught that women in the West were weak, unable to participate in such vital work, but here they were, commanding enormous machines as though it was the most natural thing in the world. Schmidt's mind reeled. This was America? The land of decadence and disorder, the place he had been taught to despise, was now revealing itself to be the very opposite of what he had been led to believe. And then there were the children. Young boys and girls, their faces serious but focused, selling newspapers at the gates of the naval base. They moved with purpose, no fear, no hesitation. Schmidt couldn't comprehend what he was seeing. Children, on their own, working in public spaces, without supervision. Back in Germany, children were kept in strict control, shielded from the harshness of life. Here, it seemed, the innocence of youth was embraced in a way that felt alien to him. The confusion deepened when he noticed something even more unsettling. No one flinched at the sight of enemy uniforms. In the world Schmidt had known, seeing an enemy in uniform would have been cause for alarm, for fear, for suspicion. But here, in this strange new world, the American workers went about their business as if nothing were out of the ordinary. The thought was unthinkable. There was no hostility, no fear. It was as if these people had not only conquered him and his comrades on the battlefield, but had also somehow broken down the very foundations of his understanding of the world. He whispered to the soldier next to him, his voice low, filled with disbelief. "These Americans are crazy." The words left his mouth almost mechanically, but inside, Schmidt was fighting to reconcile what his eyes were telling him with the beliefs he had held for so long. He had expected to see weakness, disarray, and a people who would cower in the face of enemy uniforms. Instead, what he saw was a powerful, organized society that seemed to operate on principles that were both alien and completely at odds with everything he had known. He felt as if he had stepped into a different reality, one where the rules of the world he had lived in for years no longer applied. This first moment of dissonance would only grow over time as Schmidt and the others who arrived with him began to confront even more of the contradictions that would challenge everything they had been taught. But for now, as he took his first steps onto American soil, Schmidt could only wonder at the world he had just entered. It was a world that seemed both unrecognizable and impossible. A world that no amount of training or propaganda could have prepared him for. What he had imagined was a myth, a construct of fear and prejudice. The reality of America, at least in this moment, was something far more complicated. The vast expanse of Norfolk Naval Base stretched before Unteroffizier Hans Schmidt, a sprawling complex that covered 4,300 acres of land. The site was beyond anything he had ever imagined. The docks, vast and seemingly endless, seemed to reach toward the horizon. Everywhere he looked, ships were coming and going, their presence dominated by towering cranes that moved with perfect synchronization. Each one appeared to be unloading or loading dozens of vessels at the same time, with such efficiency and order that Schmidt couldn't fathom how such a complex operation could function with such precision. The scale of it all struck him first. It wasn't just large, it was unimaginable. He had heard of the American industrial might, but nothing had prepared him for the sheer scope of it. The relentless activity was unlike anything he had experienced in his years of service. The machinery, the workers, the movements of everything around him. It all seemed to defy the expectations he had held about the disorder of America. This wasn't the disorganized, collapsing nation he had been taught about in Germany. This was a country that seemed to thrive in the midst of chaos. As Schmidt observed, he realized just how alien this place was to him. There were stands selling coffee and donuts along the sides of the streets, casual businesses operating like any other civilian establishment, yet it was a military base. He couldn't comprehend the juxtaposition. Here, in the middle of a war, civilians moved freely, living their lives, unaware of or unconcerned with the war raging across the globe. To Schmidt, it felt almost wrong. He had been conditioned to believe that war should permeate every aspect of life. Yet in America, it seemed to be a backdrop to a society that functioned as though everything were normal. The sounds around him were equally bewildering. A brass band played cheerful tunes nearby, the notes of swing music filling the air and mixing with the clatter of work. The music, with its upbeat, carefree rhythm, struck him as absurd in such a context. How could such an energy, such life, exist in a time of war? The Germans had always been taught that war demanded solemnity, gravity, and sacrifice, not the joy that seemed to emanate from the very air in America. What truly threw Schmidt off balance, however, were the people. He watched as soldiers, veterans of the North African Campaign, veterans of Rommel's army, stood together in formation, all in their military uniforms. They weren't just stationed at some distant outpost. They stood openly, in plain sight, in the midst of the bustling base. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. Back in Europe, the very sight of enemy uniforms would have been enough to cause panic. It would have been unthinkable for soldiers to walk freely through the streets or stand so openly, especially in a land so close to the enemy. Yet here, there was no sign of fear in the American workers' eyes. They didn't rush to hide or react with suspicion to the sight of soldiers in their midst. They went about their business with no more concern than if they were just passing through a normal day. The longer Schmidt watched, the deeper his sense of disorientation grew. It was as though every assumption he had carried with him, every belief about America and its supposed weakness, was being shattered. These Americans were not living in fear. They weren't trying to protect themselves from their enemies. They weren't hiding away or rushing to safety. On the contrary, they moved with an openness, an ease that Schmidt had never witnessed in the face of war. He saw workers of all races working side by side, black men and white men, women in overalls operating the enormous cranes that were unloading cargo. He had been taught to believe in racial divisions, in the superiority of certain races. But here, these lines seemed meaningless. It was a scene that defied every idea he had about the world. He had expected to see racial inequality, segregation, and oppression. These were the things he had been told America was built upon. Instead, he saw something he couldn't explain. Here, the very people he had been taught to view as inferior were standing side by side with their supposed betters, working together without any apparent sense of division. And then there were the children. They stood outside the gates selling newspapers, their young faces serious as they shouted the latest headlines. In Schmidt's mind, children were to be sheltered, protected, kept away from the harshness of the adult world. Yet here, they seemed not only to participate in society, but to do so with a kind of pride and purpose. Children had always been a symbol of innocence and weakness to Schmidt. But here they were, navigating the world with confidence, even in the middle of a global war. He watched as one little girl, no older than 10, walked past him carrying a stack of newspapers as though it were the most natural thing in the world. It felt like a scene from another planet, one that was unfathomable to him. What confused Schmidt even more was how little the Americans seemed to care about the war, or at least how little it seemed to affect their daily lives. There was no visible tension, no heightened anxiety in the air. The soldiers, the civilians, the workers, they all moved in rhythm, each one seeming to exist in harmony with the others, unaffected by the ongoing conflict. In Germany, war had permeated everything, from the way people spoke to the way they carried themselves. It had shaped their daily routines, their interactions, their very thoughts. But here, in this foreign land, war seemed like just another background noise, something distant, a concern that existed only on the fringes of everyday life. As Schmidt took it all in, the ideological shock he felt was immense. He had been convinced that America was a failed state, one that could be toppled with ease by the German war machine. He had believed that its democracy was a weakness, that its people were divided and incapable of standing together in the face of danger. He had been taught that the Americans were soft, disorganized, and would crumble under the pressure of a true military force. But now, standing in the midst of the vast humming machinery of Norfolk Naval Base, he realized how completely wrong he had been. What he was witnessing was a nation not in decline, but at the height of its power. Strong, organized, and functioning with an efficiency that left him in awe. There was a sense of freedom here, of order, of a kind of civility that Schmidt had never associated with America. This was a land of contrasts, both a war machine and a thriving society, both hardened by conflict and yet undisturbed by it. He had expected to see a shattered people struggling to keep their heads above water. Instead, he saw a nation at the height of its strength, a nation that seemed almost to mock the very idea of weakness. The more Schmidt observed, the more he felt like an outsider in this strange new world. The images that filled his mind as he arrived were being replaced by something entirely different, a reality that was both beyond his comprehension and completely at odds with everything he had been taught. This was not the America he had imagined. The ideological pillars he had built his understanding of the world upon were crumbling. And in their place, Schmidt began to see the flicker of something new, something he could not yet understand, but something that made him question everything he thought he knew. As the days passed in Norfolk, Hans Schmidt and his fellow prisoners were processed, subjected to a series of formalities that they could never have anticipated. The American officers who greeted them were not the brutal, dehumanizing figures they had expected, but men and women who approached them with a kind of cold professionalism that only deepened Schmidt's confusion. The officers, fluent in German, addressed them with respect and calmness, explaining the conditions of their captivity in a way that Schmidt found almost surreal. He had been taught to expect hostility, harsh treatment, and perhaps even cruelty. But instead, the Americans, those whom he had been taught to despise, spoke to him with a level of courtesy and understanding that unsettled him. The officers explained the Geneva Conventions, discussing the rights of prisoners of war with impeccable precision. Schmidt could hardly believe his ears as they read aloud in perfect German, the very words that the Nazis had dismissed as unimportant when convenient, or outright ignored when they did not fit their agenda. The Americans took the time to ask the prisoners about their health and their dietary needs. This small, almost trivial act of concern seemed so foreign to Schmidt, who had been taught to view enemies as subhuman, as objects to be used or disposed of rather than as individuals with rights and dignity. He had spent years under the oppressive ideology that saw prisoners as nothing more than pawns in a greater game. Yet here, he was treated with a strange level of consideration. As they were processed, the officers took notes on each man's physical state, making sure that each prisoner was properly examined and given any necessary medical attention. This was more than simple bureaucracy. It was a conscious effort to ensure that these men were not only kept alive, but treated with some semblance of respect. Schmidt, who had witnessed brutality in the German camps, could not reconcile the reality before him with the stories he had been told. There was no immediate cruelty, no hasty and harsh decisions to break the men down. The questions asked by the Americans were genuine, focused on the well-being of the prisoners. As he stood there, surrounded by his fellow soldiers, Schmidt felt the weight of an unspoken question pressing on him. What kind of country was this, where even an enemy was given such consideration? The more he observed, the more the cognitive dissonance grew. He had been taught to believe that this was a society crumbling under the weight of its own democracy, a place ripe for exploitation and collapse. But what he saw was a society that functioned with an orderly calmness that, in many ways, was superior to the military precision he had witnessed back in Germany. Every action taken by the Americans, from the way they processed prisoners to the way they handled logistics, seemed efficient and thoughtful, not chaotic or weak as he had been led to believe. The true shift in Schmidt's perception began during the first meal in the camp. The moment was almost too surreal for him to comprehend. When the prisoners sat down to eat, they were led into a large mess hall where American soldiers were already seated at the tables. Schmidt had expected to find a harsh, regimented atmosphere, one that reinforced the division between captor and captive. Instead, what he found was a baffling coexistence of two worlds. The American soldiers ate calmly at one end of the room while the German prisoners sat at the other. They shared the same space, used the same serving lines, and ate the same meals. Meals that, Schmidt noted with some surprise, were of higher quality than any meal he had experienced in the past years of the war. What was more perplexing, however, was the apparent indifference of the American soldiers to the presence of their enemies. There was no hostility, no anger, no sign of the dehumanizing hatred that Schmidt had been taught to expect. The American soldiers seemed completely unfazed by the presence of the Germans in the room, and they went about their business with a casualness that was almost jarring. Schmidt had expected the Americans to show their power by treating their enemies with contempt, but here, they seemed to be treating them like ordinary men. It was as though the whole concept of being an enemy had been trivialized, as if the very idea of such a division was something alien to the American way of life. As the meal continued, Schmidt couldn't help but feel a profound sense of disorientation. He had expected to see enemies eating separately, perhaps behind bars or in some isolated corner of the camp. Instead, the Germans and Americans were sharing the same space, eating the same food, with no apparent tension. The only thing that separated them was the uniform. It was a scene that defied logic, a scenario that shattered everything Schmidt had understood about the nature of war, about the nature of enemies. But what struck him most deeply was the way the American soldiers behaved. While the prisoners sat quietly, still processing the bizarre reality they were experiencing, the Americans paid no particular attention to them. Instead, they focused on a small radio, listening intently to a broadcast of a baseball game. The soldiers, as Schmidt observed, were more interested in the game than in the men who had once been their enemies. There was no fear in their eyes, no anger, not even the slightest sense of superiority. They were just men, sitting down to a meal, watching a game, enjoying a moment of normalcy amid the chaos of war. This nonchalance, this complete absence of fear or animosity, was the most confusing aspect of the entire experience. Schmidt's mind struggled to keep up with the strange new world unfolding around him. This was not how things were supposed to be. In Germany, prisoners of war were treated harshly, their status as enemies used as a justification for cruelty. But here, in America, the very concept of enemy seemed to lose its meaning. The Americans treated their enemies not with contempt, but with a strange kind of normalcy. It was as if the distinctions between captor and captive, victor and vanquished, were not as important as Schmidt had been led to believe. It was a reality that made no sense to him, and yet it was undeniable. As the days went on, Schmidt found it increasingly difficult to hold on to the beliefs he had brought with him. Every moment spent in this strange new world chipped away at the walls of ideology that had been carefully built over the years. What he had once believed was a certainty, the inherent superiority of the German way of life, the weakness of democracy, the dishonorable nature of the Americans, was now beginning to crumble. The idea that the war could be won through force and conquest alone seemed increasingly hollow in the face of the reality before him. The Americans were not only winning the war, they were winning something far more important, something that could not be measured by the destruction of enemy forces or the number of battles fought. They were winning the hearts and minds of their prisoners, breaking down the very foundations of the enemy's ideology without ever raising a weapon. Schmidt couldn't help but be shaken by what he was witnessing. The Americans were showing him something he had never expected to see, that the true strength of a nation was not in its military might, but in its ability to maintain its values even in the midst of war. As the days turned into weeks, Schmidt began to question everything he had ever known. The doubts that had been slowly creeping into his mind now began to take root, and he could no longer ignore the profound impact that this new world was having on him. He had come to America as an enemy, but now, as he sat there, surrounded by the unyielding normalcy of the American way of life, he began to wonder if, perhaps, he had been wrong all along. As days turned into weeks, Schmidt's perception of the world around him began to shift. What he had once seen as a system of inherent weakness and decay, a fractured democracy on the brink of collapse, now appeared fundamentally different. The more he observed the Americans, the more he realized that their society was based on principles he had never been taught to value, let alone recognize. He had come to view America through the lens of Nazi ideology, which painted the country as a land of chaos, devoid of honor or order. But what he saw instead was a society that not only respected human rights, but also practiced them even when dealing with enemies. It wasn't just a nation of victors. It was a nation that operated on a set of principles that revered the dignity of the individual, regardless of the person's status as an enemy or a prisoner. The more Schmidt witnessed, the more he began to question the very foundations of the beliefs he had carried with him. The German military doctrine had always viewed prisoners of war as either burdens to be minimized or assets to be exploited. But in America, prisoners were treated as people. Their temporary loss of freedom did not define them. They were not permanently branded as enemies, nor were they to be dehumanized. To Schmidt, this was revolutionary. It contradicted everything he had known about captivity and enemy status. Prisoners in the German system were often stripped of their humanity, punished not only for their opposition, but for their very existence as captives. In contrast, here in America, prisoners seemed to retain their dignity, their rights, and most importantly, their humanity. They were, in a strange way, treated as temporary guests in a country that had no intention of keeping them as enemies forever. Schmidt began to realize that the American system of treating prisoners of war was rooted in a deep respect for individual rights. He watched the way the Americans interacted with the prisoners, how they listened to their needs, asked about their well-being, and made efforts to ensure they were cared for. Even in the midst of war, these people did not abandon their humanity. Schmidt had always believed that war required the loss of civility. that victory could only be achieved through the complete subjugation of the enemy. But the way the Americans treated their prisoners forced him to reconsider this view. They did not see the prisoners as something to be broken or controlled. They saw them as people who, for the time being, had lost their freedom. This realization began to alter Schmidt's perception of both the American people and his own role in the war. He had come to view himself as a soldier of the Third Reich, a warrior in a righteous cause, but now he was beginning to question what righteousness truly meant. The first real shift in his thinking occurred when a Soviet prisoner was brought into the camp. The man, weak and gaunt from months of deprivation, complained about the lack of food, his voice hoarse and desperate. Schmidt had seen such men before, in the brutal conditions of the Eastern Front, and he had witnessed the contempt with which they were often treated by both the Germans and the Soviets. But here, in the American camp, things were different. The Americans did not turn a blind eye to the Soviet prisoner's suffering. Instead, they swiftly arranged for him to be taken to the medical facilities, where he would receive the care he needed. Schmidt could hardly believe his eyes. In Norway or on the Eastern Front, a prisoner in such a state would have been left to suffer, possibly even left to die. There would have been no compassion, no effort to help. But here, in America, there was nothing but respect for the prisoner's basic human rights, even though he was an enemy. As Schmidt witnessed this simple act of kindness, a profound realization began to take root in his mind. The Americans, even at war, were not abandoning their principles of humanity. They didn't treat the Soviet prisoner as a symbol of their enemy, but as a person who had fallen victim to the horrors of war. They understood that the man's suffering was not a result of his being an enemy, but a consequence of war itself. This was a realization that began to fundamentally alter Schmidt's perception of not only the Americans, but of war and humanity itself. The notion that one could wage war and still maintain a sense of human dignity and compassion was entirely foreign to him. But here, in this camp, it was being put into practice. He began to wonder how a nation that held such values could be seen as weak, as he had once been taught to believe. In the weeks that followed, Schmidt continued to witness more of these small but profound acts of compassion. Prisoners who had been injured were treated with the same care and attention as the American soldiers. Even those who were sick or mentally exhausted were given medical care without hesitation. There were no distinctions made between enemy and ally when it came to the basic principle of human dignity. The soldiers and the officers did not see the prisoners as merely a means to an end, as they had been taught to view them. Instead, they saw them as individuals deserving of respect. This was a shift so profound that it completely unsettled Schmidt. His entire understanding of warfare, of what it meant to be a soldier, was beginning to unravel. As he spent more time in the camp, Schmidt's sense of identity also began to shift. He had come to America as a soldier of the Third Reich, deeply indoctrinated by the ideology that he had been raised on. He had believed in the righteousness of the Nazi cause, in the superiority of the Aryan race, and in the necessity of war to achieve their vision of the world. But now, as he watched the Americans treat him and his fellow prisoners with a level of respect he had never experienced before, he began to question the very foundation of those beliefs. Could a society that treated its enemies with such dignity and respect truly be the enemy? Was it possible that the ideology he had lived by was wrong? The dissonance between what he had been taught and what he was witnessing in America grew more unbearable with each passing day. Schmidt's transformation was slow, but inevitable. He began to internalize the lessons he was learning, not from lectures or propaganda, but from the very actions of the people around him. The kindness, the respect, the humanity. It all seemed to speak louder than anything he had been told about the superiority of the German way of life. In the weeks that followed, Schmidt started to shed the old beliefs that had defined him for so long. His identity as a soldier of the Third Reich began to feel hollow, and the values he had held so dearly were replaced by something new, a sense of justice, of fairness, and of respect for others. These were the values that the Americans had embodied, and they were beginning to define him in ways that were entirely foreign to his past self. He was no longer just a soldier. He was someone who had seen the true cost of war, the real meaning of humanity, and he could never go back to the way things were before. Through the kindness and respect shown by his captors, Schmidt was beginning to understand that there was a greater strength in humanity than in violence. He had come to America believing it was a broken society, but now he saw it as a society that had figured out what it meant to truly live with dignity, even in the most trying of circumstances. This new understanding was a painful but necessary transformation. Schmidt was no longer just a soldier in a war. He was a witness to the power of human compassion and respect, and he would never see the world the same way again. Hans Schmidt spent several months in the American prison camp, and as time passed, what had once been a world of confusion and disbelief began to transform into something more profound. At first, he had struggled to reconcile the reality before him with the ideals he had been taught. The contradictions were overwhelming. But as the days turned into weeks and then months, Schmidt began to change. The harsh rigidity of his past views softened, replaced by an openness to new ideas, new values, and new ways of thinking. The America he had once viewed through the lens of Nazi propaganda as a fractured and weak society slowly revealed itself to be a place where the principles of fairness, equality, and respect for human dignity were not just ideals but living, breathing aspects of everyday life. In the beginning, Schmidt had viewed America with suspicion, discomfort, and even contempt. The respect given to prisoners of war, the kindness shown by soldiers to enemies, and the apparent lack of fear or hatred in the American people had all seemed impossible to him. These were things that he had been taught to expect only from a society that had already fallen, torn apart by its own weaknesses. But as the months passed, Schmidt came to realize that the America he had encountered was not the one he had been led to believe in. The more he observed, the more he saw that this was a society not defined by weakness, but by strength. Strength in its ability to maintain its values even in the face of war. The transformation within Schmidt was not immediate, nor was it simple. It occurred gradually, piece by piece, as he spent more time with the Americans. It wasn't just the way they treated him that changed his perspective, but the way they treated each other. He saw how American soldiers, regardless of their rank or background, treated their fellow soldiers with respect and decency. He witnessed how civilians, too, lived their lives with a sense of openness and egalitarianism that was in stark contrast to the rigid hierarchies and oppressive ideologies he had grown up with. The more Schmidt absorbed the reality of life in America, the more he began to understand that the true strength of a society lay not in its ability to dominate others, but in its ability to nurture and protect the dignity of every individual, even in the most difficult of circumstances. One of the most profound changes that took place within Schmidt was his growing tolerance. He began to recognize the value in diversity and inclusion, something that had been completely foreign to him in the past. In the American camp, he had seen black and white soldiers working side by side, treating each other as equals. He had witnessed women operating cranes, commanding respect and authority in a way that had once seemed impossible to him. He had come to understand that America was a society that was willing to challenge the status quo, that was willing to accept the imperfections of humanity and yet still strive towards something greater. He began to see that the freedoms America afforded its citizens, the ability to speak openly, to criticize the government, to express opinions without fear of reprisal, were not signs of weakness, but signs of strength. These were the foundations of a democratic society that had the resilience to face not just external threats, but internal divisions as well. As the months went by, Schmidt's understanding of his own place in the world began to shift. He no longer saw himself as a soldier in a noble cause, a hero fighting for the future of the Aryan race. Instead, he began to see himself as part of a much larger story, a story that was about humanity, about understanding the inherent worth of every individual. The very ideology that had once defined him now seemed increasingly hollow and unworthy of the sacrifices he had made. He began to see that the world he had been taught to believe in, the world of rigid hierarchies, of racial purity, of war as a means of achieving power, was a world that only led to destruction and suffering. The change that had taken place within Schmidt was not just intellectual, it was deeply emotional as well. He had come to America as an enemy, filled with hatred and suspicion, and he left with a deep respect for the very society he had been taught to despise. The lessons he had learned in the American camp would stay with him for the rest of his life. He had seen what it meant to treat people with dignity, to respect their rights, and to embrace the ideals of democracy not as a distant dream, but as a functioning reality. He had seen how a society, even in the midst of war, could remain grounded in its values, and how those values could make all the difference in the world. When Schmidt returned to Germany, he brought with him more than just knowledge of the enemy. He brought with him a new worldview, one that was informed by the lessons he had learned in the American camp. He no longer saw the world in terms of rigid categories of enemy and ally. Instead, he saw a complex, interconnected world in which every individual had inherent worth, regardless of their nationality or background. He understood now that the true strength of a nation was not in its military power, but in its ability to respect the rights of its citizens and treat others with fairness and dignity. These were the values that he had come to hold dear, and he would spend the rest of his life fighting for them. Schmidt's transformation was a profound one. It wasn't just a change in his beliefs, it was a change in his identity. He had entered the camp as a soldier, a man defined by his allegiance to a regime that espoused hatred and division. He left the camp as a different person altogether, a person who understood the value of democracy, the importance of human rights, and the need for tolerance and respect in a world that had been torn apart by war. Schmidt's journey was not just a personal one. It was a reflection of the broader changes that were taking place in Europe after the war. His experience was a reminder that even in the most difficult of circumstances, it was possible for individuals to change, to learn, and to grow. The lessons that Schmidt had learned in the American prison camp would stay with him for the rest of his life. He would never forget the kindness and humanity he had witnessed, the way that the Americans treated their enemies with respect and dignity, and the way that their society functioned on principles of fairness and equality. In the years that followed, he would become an advocate for democracy, for open societies, and for the rights of individuals. He would work tirelessly to promote the values he had learned, sharing his story with others in the hope that they too would come to understand the importance of respect, tolerance, and humanity in a world that was still healing from the wounds of war. Schmidt's story was not just one of personal transformation. It was a story of the power of ideals, the resilience of humanity, and the potential for change, even in the darkest of times. His journey from a soldier of the Third Reich to a proponent of democracy and human rights was a testament to the capacity of individuals to change, to learn, and to grow, and to become part of a world that was, in the end, greater than the sum of its divisions.